Welcome to this explainer. Look, in July 2026, a massive transatlantic escalation erupted between the European Union and the United States. And at the heart of it all, a record-breaking fine, aggressive digital market regulation, and the very real threat of sweeping trade tariffs. But as we know, in conflicts like this, the gap between political rhetoric and executed legal reality is literally everything. So today, we're going to systematically separate exactly what happened from what just might happen.
To do that, here is our agenda. We'll trace the 48-hour escalation, compare the DMA against Section 301, clarify some parallel tariff actions, examine the Turnberry conditionality, evaluate the competing interpretations, and finally, look at future scenarios and the key indicators you need to watch.
All right, starting right off with Part 1, the 48-hour escalation.
Let's look at exactly what went down chronologically. On July 23, 2026, the European Commission officially fined Google €890 million. Literally that exact same day, the United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer issued a formal statement strongly condemning the action. And by the very next day, July 24th, President Donald Trump took to social media to announce the initiation of a Section 301 trade investigation against the EU. So in just 48 hours, a regulatory penalty rapidly transformed into a major international trade dispute.
Now that €890 million penalty wasn't just some blanket antitrust charge. It was targeted specifically for violations of the European Union's Digital Markets Act, or the DMA. It boils down into two distinct violations. €460 million for what they call self-preferencing on Google Search, and €430 million for anti-steering practices on Google Play. And alongside this hefty fine, the Commission officially ordered Google to bring all of this non-compliance to an immediate end.
In response, the official rhetoric out of Washington did not hold back. On July 24th, President Trump announced that investigation via social media, and he explicitly classified the EU's regulatory enforcement as robbing American companies. He threatened a substantial tariff to ensure those penalties would be reversed. However, to really understand this, we have to classify this strictly as an executive statement threatening future consequences rather than an immediately executed legal action. Words matter here.
Which brings us nicely to Part 2, DMA versus Section 301.
Let's compare the operational parameters of both of these systems because they are very different. The EU's Digital Markets Act operates as an ex-ante framework. What that means is it sets preemptive, mandatory obligations for designated gatekeepers, like Google, leading directly to formal regulatory fines if they step out of line. Conversely, the U.S. Trade Act of 1974, specifically Section 301, well, that's a statutory trade enforcement tool. It requires specific, discretionary steps from the USTR, including formal consultations with the foreign government, and it generally establishes a 12-month deadline to make the determination after formal initiation. It's a much longer runway.
So here is the absolute crucial distinction you need to keep in mind. Despite the incredibly high-profile political announcement on social media on July 24th, as of our July 25th research cutoff, no Federal Register notice documenting a formal USTR initiation of this digital markets investigation had actually been published. This means the tariffs were threatened, for sure, but the formal administrative process to actually enact them was not yet publicly documented as initiated. Tariffs in this particular digital dispute were and are not a certainty.
Let's move into Part 3, clarifying parallel tariff actions. Now, things get a little tricky, because on the very same day President Trump announced the digital markets investigation, the U.S. implemented a totally separate, legally finalized set of Section 301 tariffs on 60 different economies, which did include the EU. These applied additional rates of 10 to 12.5%, but they were based on a completely different forced labor investigation. It is absolutely vital that we explicitly isolate the active forced labor tariffs from this digital markets threat. The digital dispute was announced, but the forced labor tariffs were actually enacted.
Okay, Part 4, the Turnberry conditionality.
If a formalized Section 301 retaliation actually moves forward, it's going to interact directly with the Turnberry Bridge. Turnberry was a macroeconomic architecture designed to stabilize transatlantic trade by capping U.S. baseline tariffs at 15% in exchange for zero EU tariffs on most U.S. industrial goods. However, there's a catch. The proposed legislation contains a suspension clause. So, if the U.S. formally applies new tariffs over the digital markets dispute, then the European Commission could propose suspending its tariff preferences for U.S. goods, and that would result in a broad, highly disruptive tariff escalation across the board.
But a critical condition remains unmet right now. While the European Parliament voted to approve its position on Turnberry back in June 2026, ratification by the Council of the European Union was still pending as of late July. This means the suspension mechanism is not yet legally operative. Any Turnberry consequences are strictly conditional on that pending ratification happening, plus the actual application of new U.S. tariffs.
Moving on to Part 5, Evaluating Competing Interpretations.
As you'd expect, there are two heavily disputed interpretations of this entire conflict. On one side, the European Commission asserts legitimate regulatory sovereignty. They argue that the DMA applies universally based on objective market rules to ensure fair competition, and they point out that they review non-US companies as well. In stark contrast to that, the USTR alleges discriminatory protectionism. They argue the DMA functions basically as a non-tariff barrier that disproportionately targets American technology firms to handicap their global competitive advantage.
To put this into perspective, the €890 million DMA fine is massive, absolutely, but it follows a long history of multi-billion euro antitrust penalties in Europe, like the famous €4.1 billion Android antitrust fine. Now, while these penalties are incredibly vast and highly concentrated on U.S. firms, legally speaking, this data alone does not definitively confirm systemic bias or discriminatory intent in the actual writing of the law itself. There are also secondary stakeholder claims fueling the U.S. response here. USTR Greer officially claimed that the Google fines equate to over 2% of the entire EU budget, which suggests a revenue extraction motive. He also pointed to parallel friction, like the European Investment Bank signing a €1 billion loan with Airbus, suggesting Europe is shielding its own manufacturing while attacking U.S. tech. Furthermore, U.S. IP holders have warned that a proposed EU copyright policy threatens $300 million in American royalties. Now, it is critical we classify these as stakeholder allegations and contextual trade grievances, rather than verified factual motives.
Finally, Part 6, Scenarios and Future Indicators. Based entirely on statutory realities, we can trace three strictly conditional pathways going forward. Scenario 1, constructive engagement. This is where mandatory statutory consultations actually yield a technical compromise from Google before any tariffs hit. Scenario 2, rapid retaliation, where the U.S. issues fast tariffs which could then trigger the EU Turnberry suspension, but remember, only if the EU Council ratifies it first. And Scenario 3, domestic judicial intervention. Interestingly, there's an ongoing lawsuit right now called Burlap and Barrel that's challenging the separate forced labor tariffs on constitutional grounds. This provides a theoretical legal pathway for U.S. importers to challenge any expedited digital market tariffs in domestic court.
So, as we wrap up this analysis, let's just categorize exactly what is known versus what remains totally unresolved. We know for a fact the EU fine was issued. We know the separate forced labor tariffs are active. But the unknowns are what will dictate what happens next. We are waiting to see if the USTR publishes a formal Federal Register notice actually initiating the digital markets probe. We don't know Google's formal appeal path yet, and we are waiting on that Turnberry Council ratification. These are the verifiable data points you need to track to follow this escalation.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question. Will sovereign technology regulation ultimately be subordinated to the sheer pressure of bilateral trade leverage, or will the European Union withstand the pressure and cement the DMA as the dominant standard for digital platforms globally? The outcome of this transatlantic friction is going to define the rules of the global digital economy for decades. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep a close eye on the Federal Register and, as always, keep learning.